Welcome, dear listener. Tonight's gentle reading is part of our quiet history series of Napoleon letters to Josephine. Though the title evokes imperial whispers, our pages this evening open upon an American household on the brink of change. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe. It helps us immensely and allows us to continue sharing peaceful bedtime history. It begins when the notion of moving to Virginia is first raised in the home of General Percival Smith, a former brigadier. The idea falls like a stone into still water, sending rings of consternation through the family. Norma and Blanche, the young daughters, rise together in spirited protest, picturing cows and snakes, rough bread and rare mail, solitude and silence to them. Rustic beauty is best admired between gilt covers or across the footlights, not lived day by day. Their mother, tender and patient, tries to comfort them, offering small hopes and soft assurances, yet every suggestion returns to her heavy with complaint, while the house hums with questions and preparations, and she alone must stay and bear it all. Her boys, hungry for novelty, are rapturous. Her daughters sulk and weep by turns, and always in the mother's heart one thought outweighs the rest. Warner, the elder son, pale and beloved, is slipping away by slow degrees. A chill, an overexertion, and the old sorrowful pattern has begun its quiet work for Warner. The physicians speak plainly and defer to a higher medicine, not wanderings, but a home and air, both bracing and mild, with pure milk and tender care. The city's breath is too languid. The country's wind, kissed by fields and forest, may yet help the struggling lungs. The only hope, they say, is nature. The general, trained to decide and act, listens and chooses at once to him. Virginia is sun-warmed and flower-soft, a region of kindly weather and pine-scented breeze. The doctors think it far north of their first choices, yet they yield. He, recalling old days near the lower Chesapeake, is certain it will do. He remembers night air sweetened by the ocean, noon heat dry and bright, evenings that cooled like water poured from a clear jar. He remembers the pines, their resin perfume like a quiet strength, and how even a strong man felt better simply by breathing there in those campaigning years. The wish was planted to return one day and make a home where amorous ocean wooed. A gracious land life swept the wish aside and brought it back again, as memories sometimes do plains with Custer, mountain posts, city winters, and still those Virginia evenings drifted over him like a gentle spell. In thought, he sat again in the tent door, watching gray shadows move out from the trees, scouts of the night, while whip poor wills called and partridges chimed from distant fields. So when the time for a country home arrives, the old fancy rises and points south. He goes and returns with his mind full of a place he has bought, imagining the household joy his news will kindle. But instead of gentle praise, he finds a storm of discontent and is amazed. "What are they grumbling about?" he asks his wife with soldierly directness. "Surely the plantation has good water and superb air, gardens in plenty and fine oyster beds. The house is old-fashioned yet comfortable, and a little money will make it more. So what then is amiss?" "They are young." The mother answers softly. "They are used to society and admiration, to variety and sparkle. Gardens and oyster beds are pleasures. They do not yet understand the country. To their minds must be dull, not dull," says the general. "It is no lonely isle, but one of the most sociable corners of the oldest state in the Union." The former owner told him the neighborhood is thickly settled, and he himself counted 5 gentlemen's houses in view. If the girls wish for visits and dances and boating, they shall have enough of such tomfoolery to satisfy any heart. The mother, practical and kind, asks if there are young men. "There are always men," he replies, a little weary of the topic in the nearby village. Wintergreen. He noticed many, and one young fellow in particular, tall, fair, missing an arm, seated on a tobacco hogshead. Directing labor at the wharf, the face stirred a memory from the war. Though he cannot place it, she wishes he had asked the name, for such a tie could ease their arrival still. The knowledge that there are neighbors, and perhaps interesting ones, makes the prospect kinder, though she feels distant from southern ways, and holds her own fixed sympathies and misgivings. All of it fades before the single aim of helping Warner breathe and live. She brings the news to her daughters, brightening the corners, as mothers do. Blanche looks up from her needlework with interest, but Norma turns to the window and watches the street, brooding. "I wonder what Nesbit Thorne will think," she murmurs at last, giving voice to the true thorn in her thoughts. "He'll hate it," Blanche declares, loyal to her sister's mood, but Percival, 12 years old and spirited as a flame, bristles at once. Nesbit, he insists, is no spoiled dreamer. He will love the hunting and fishing, the real things that matter to men. He vows to ask Nesbit to come to Shirley for the autumn shooting, to be taught to handle a gun and do it well from the sofa by the window. Warner smiles faintly. "Nesbit," he says, "returned last night. He passes the house even now if his opinion matters so very much. Call him in and ask." Norma taps lightly on the glass and beckons. He crosses the street with an easy nod and steps inside, a familiar presence arriving just as the family story is poised to turn. Hall turned expectantly toward the door, pausing in their several occupations. Even Warner lifted his eyes from his book. Though his notice was grudging and involuntary, the little circle's attitude told of the influence the coming man held over each of them, an influence that spread to all within Nesbit Thorne's familiar orbit. He was Mrs. Smith's nephew, often making her house his home whenever he was in New York. For he had none of his own now. He was slender and dark, with magnificent eyes whose expression enthralled and defied criticism of the rest of his face. Not one man in 50 could say whether he was handsome or otherwise. Women, perhaps, knew best what they thought in his air and carriage. There was a force that drew and held attention, vitality, individuality, the something that compels regard. He was not tall, yet tall men did not dwarf him. He was plain, yet handsomer men stood aside while the world turned toward him. There are men whose lives are intaglios, cut deep into the sard of their generations, every line charged with interest and emotion. Such men are loved and hated, feared and adored. With an intensity their commonplace fellows never stir. They are lodestones for events, whirlpools that draw excitement and sympathy to themselves. Nesbit Thorne was of this kind some years before, fresh from Harvard and bright with promise. A leader in society whose name was already spoken with expectation, he made a hasty and ill-advised marriage with Miss Ethel Ross, a New York beauty of rare wit and charm. Her thought was pleasure, her highest reading of life, a changing feast of social delight. Duty, to her, was a well-ordered house, sumptuous entertainments, irreproachable dress. She would have suited a husband unexacting and easily led. Thorne, unfortunately, was none of these things. For a few months, the way was gilded by his passionate enjoyment of her mere perfection and his pride in the admiration she drew. The smooth river began to show snags and fretting reefs beneath the bright surface. The water turned troubled and tossed. Their boat of happiness was flung from side to side, contesting hands upon the ropes, until, after a cruise of as many months as should have made years, it lay a wreck upon the bar of separation. The ending, however, was managed gracefully, and with proper regard for appearances. Gossip fluttered and fell. Rumors ran the gamut from infidelity to bankruptcy, lived their little day, and were replaced by others equally baseless, and equally enjoyed. The only fact that stood firm was the fact of separation. the lasting conclusion that it had been arranged with tact, the divorce, which seemed the natural outcome. Lagged people remembered that the Thornes were Roman Catholic and guessed at scruples as for Mrs. Thorne. She had no sufficient reason to seek absolute release, and she held a greater command over his income. As his wife, when the crisis came, Thorne disappeared quietly for a year. There were whispers of Tartary, of the Niger, of Siberia. At the year's end, he returned to New York and resumed his place as though nothing untoward had befallen. He lived at his club and was never seen within his own house. Sometimes in the park, he paused to speak to the nurse and caress his little son. His life was that of a single man in the society. Both frequented, he encountered his wife often, and treated her with scrupulous politeness, even marked courtesy if he ever missed his home or felt regret. He hid it behind an unmoved front. For want of nearer ties, he made himself at home in his aunt's drawing room, as in the days before his marriage. In his strong, almost passionate nature, there was one weakness. He needed the love and admiration of women as he needed air. It came not from cruelty or vanity, for he had less of both than most men, but from the restlessness of a soul searching for its mate, that sorrow might come to others in the search he scarcely heeded. Their loss, he thought, was balanced by his own. He had never yet loved as he could love. The ego was still predominant. He was always in some measure experimenting toward happiness. As he entered the room after weeks away, with a smile and a pleasant word, the younger ones rose in a cheerful tumult. Even Warner, often jealous of his cousin's sway, forgot it for the moment and joined. The chorus. Advice was demanded, sympathy invoked, congratulations poured upon him before he had fairly reached a chair. He laughed and lifted a hand. "Hold on, don't all talk at once." "What is it, Norma?" His eye had turned to his favorite involuntarily. Her brow cleared as she met it, and with Percival's irrepressible help, she unfolded their family plan. Thorne threw himself into it with warm good humor, pronounced it charming, and prophesied all manner of happy outcomes. Percival, enchanted, drew close and began a series of eager whispers that lasted the length of the visit. Norma brightened more and more when Thorne vowed he would pay them a long visit during the hunting season. A smile wreathed her crimson lips, and poor little Blanche was snubbed for daring to be lachrymose. The talk grew merrier, and the mother listened, smiling, her eyes resting tenderly on Warner's face. The sick boy was wrapped over the ancient house, mossed with history and tradition. That was to be his future home. Seeing his eager interest, her heart gave a sudden bound. Hope took her by the hand, and she dreamed dreams. Perhaps there might come a turn for the better. Sometimes the intuition of an invalid is nature's own voice, crying for what is needed. Warner's longing for change might be the first herald of his cure who could read the future morning. Meanwhile, lifted soft light upon another household, quiet and far away, backward and forward, from pantry to sideboard, from sideboard to china closet. Pocahontas Mason set the breakfast table. She laid the pretty mats on the shining mahogany, arranged the old blue cups and saucers, and placed plates and napkins. With swift, sure hands she sang softly as she worked. Every movement deft and noiseless. In the center stood a plump Wedgwood pitcher filled with geraniums and roses, which her fingers coaxed and turned, until each blossom showed bravely. On a near corner, by the waiter, rested a neat little basket of keys, a fresh handkerchief thrust through its handle. When the table was in order, she turned to the room, giving it those numberless touches that make even a plain place look gracious and home-like. Times had changed with the Masons, and many duties once left to servants now fell naturally to the daughter of the house. Perhaps it was an improvement. Her brother Berkeley maintained that it was. She crossed to one of the tall windows and pushed open the half-closed blinds, letting in a flood of sunshine and morning air. An ottoman, covered with drab cloth and worked long ago in wreaths of roses and pansies, stood beneath the sill, kneeling there. She rested her arms on the high ledge and looked out over the lawn, drinking the dewy freshness the September light touched to gold the bronze abundance of her hair, which the frolic breeze tumbled into 1,000 witching curls. Her face, set in that bright aureole, was pure and handsome, patrician in every line, from the noble forehead and delicate brows to the well-cut, resolute chin. Her eyes were gray, the truest charm of her countenance, with an outlook frank and fearless as a child's. The house, neutral tinted by years and respectability, stood well back from the river, to whose brink the smooth green lawn swept in gentle undulation. The river here was broad and tranquil, moving without haste toward the sea across the water. A dense fringe of trees on the far shore rose dark against the warm blue. The country lay flat, yet it was saved from monotony by a pastoral peace and a look of careless plenty that thrift might have turned to abundance in the meadows. The grass grew rich between tall stacks of hay. The fields of corn and tobacco promised a noble harvest. The river teemed with life and a kind of easy-going energy. Shabby fishing smacks with dingy white sails slipped past like birds too indolent to preen. Flat-bottomed canoes, manned by good-humored Negro oystermen, plied a lazy trade with passing steamers. Somewhere behind the house, a gate slammed. There came a cheerful chorus of neighs and trampling hooves. Pocahontas leaned out, shading her eyes to watch the colts careering across the lawn, manes and tails aloft in the light after them. Sedate and beautiful came a black mare, stepping high and dainty as a lady of distinction, Kentucky born and bred. She could claim Goldenrod himself for sire. At a soft whistle, she condescended to approach the window and accept sugar and caresses. Pocahontas patted the glossy head and neck, murmuring fond nonsense as the little heap of sugar vanished. Last she laid an empty palm against the eager nose and gave it a gentle tap. "That's all, Phyllis. Truly all this morning you would empty the sugar bowl if I let you know, my beauty. 11 great lumps, and the feast is ended." But Phyllis would not be convinced. She pushed her nose higher over the sill and whinnied softly. Begging for more, Pocahontas drew back into the room, laughing. "Not another lump. Greedy Phyllis. Go and play with the colts. You will get no more today." "You will never make Phyllis believe that, my dear," said a tall, gray-haired lady in a pretty muslin cap, who had entered unperceived. "Oh yes, mother, she understands quite well. See, she is moving off already. Phyllis knows I never break my word, and that persuasion is quite useless," said Pocahontas. She turned to give her mother the customary morning kiss, set her chair in place, and admired how becoming her new cap was. The Masons never neglected small courtesies to one another. The branch of the Mason family still living at the old homestead of Lanarth had dwindled to 4 Mrs. Mason, who had not changed her name when she married her cousin, Temple Mason, of Lanarth, her son, Berkeley, and the daughters, Grace and Pocahontas. There had been another son, Temple the younger, whose story was one of those sad memories that remain as the grim aftertaste of war. All 3 of the Masons had worn gray. The father had fallen in a charge at Malvern Hill, the elder son had lost his right arm, and the younger had died in prison. Of the 2 daughters, Grace had early fulfilled her destiny in true Virginian fashion by marrying a distant kinsman, Mr. Royal Garnett, a playmate of her brother's whose plantation lay in an adjoining county. With calm conservatism, Mrs. Garnett repeated the placid pattern of her parents' early years, content to rule her household wisely, to love and minister to her husband, and to rear her children according to time-honored precedent. Pocahontas, the youngest, remained unmarried, nay, more, still unengaged. They had called her Pocahontas in obedience to that unwritten law of Southern families, which decrees that an ancestor's name of distinction shall be visited upon generations of descendants. Whatever its harshness, it seems a peculiarity of the distinguished to possess names singularly devoid of beauty. Among the burdens pride lays upon posterity, this is a grievous one. Some families, with the forest taint in their blood, early took refuge in the softer Matawaka. Not so the Masons they prided themselves on, never shirking an obligation, and they did not evade this one. Having accepted Pocahontas as the name by which their ancestress was best known, they held to it undaunted by its length and sound, unmoved by historians who showed that Pocahontas was no formal name at all, but rather a pet sobriquet for Indian maidens, and of slight dignity historians might discover, disagree, and explain. Yet Pocahontas followed Pocahontas in the Mason family, with the certainty of a fixed law to the present Pocahontas, the eighth in line. It seemed as though the thing should stop. She yielded in her own case, not having been consulted, but when Grace's little daughter was born, she put in a plea. Break the spell, she entreated, and unborn generations will bless you. We Virginians will keep one groove until the crack of doom, unless someone jerks us out of it by the nape of the neck. Your heart ought to yearn over the child. Mine does. It is a sin to give a pretty baby so monstrous a name. Grace trampled on the protest. Not name her Pocahontas. Of course I shall, if the name were twice as long and 3 times as ugly. My baby should bear it. You know that every Pocahontas in the family has turned out an exceptionally fine woman. All have been noble, truthful, honorable, quick to see the right and unswerving in pursuit of it. I shall call my baby by that name, and no other Pocahontas opened her eyes. Why, Grace, you speak as if the name were a talisman, as if virtues were transmitted with it. Is not that a little silly? Grace answered gently, but promptly, not at all. Unless we cease to be ourselves after death, we must still take interest in the things of this world, in our families and descendants. We may not transmit our virtues, but by guardian influence, we can help our children imitate ancestral good. Guardian angels of our own blood are nearer than any others, and I believe the Lord appoints them whenever he can. If so, why should not the good women who are in heaven take interest in my baby, who will bear their name? It is their name still, and it must grieve them to see it soiled. Were I an angel, the child on earth who bore my name should be my special charge then. By your showing, laughed Pocahontas, softened in spite of herself. 6 good women, now holy angels, have baby and me in constant keeping for love of our ugly name. The idea is fanciful, and I doubt it is orthodox, but it is pretty, and I like it. Miss Pocahontas the 9th. You and I must walk with circumspection, lest we grieve the good ladies above, who take such kindly interest in us. She mocked at Grace's idea. Yet it pleased her, and worked upon her more than she knew. She loved the legends of her house, and cherished descent from brave men and true women. The past held her more than is common with the young, and she sought and treasured all the records of the 6 who had borne her name, from the swarthy Indian princess down to the gentle gray-haired lady, now at the Lanarth breakfast table. Princess, said Mrs. Mason, as she measured out sugar and cream, I wish you would ring the bell. Rachel must have breakfast ready by this time. And I hear Berkeley's step outside. Princess rang the bell meekly. The pet name was as familiar among them as her real one, and her touch gave no hint of imperiousness. Aunt Rachel, the old family servant, faithful, portly, and important, hated to be hurried. It pestered her, she said, and made her spoil the victuals. Yet she answered promptly this morning, entering with the large tray of hot and savory dishes before the bell had ceased its faint tintinnabulation. Berkeley, a tall, fair man whose right sleeve was fastened against his breast, came in also. I saw Jim Bird this morning. he said as he seated himself. After the accustomed greetings, he called on his way to Roy Garnett's to bid goodbye. I asked him to breakfast, but he could not stay. He had promised Grace to eat with them. He must make a farewell tour, or our old neighbor's feelings will be hurt. It is rather hard on Jim, but he could not bear to slight anyone. I suggested a barbecue and a speech in Bow, but the idea did not appeal to him, poor old fellow. Could he not contrive to hold Shirley, Burke? Asked Mrs. Mason, as she passed his cup. He kept it so long there must have been some way. Berkeley shook his head. No, the thing was impossible. The plantation was mortgaged to the hub before Jim was born. The birds have been extravagant for generations, and a crash was certain. Old Mr. Bird could barely meet the interest. Even before the loss of Cousin Mary's money during his last years, some of the interest was added to the principal, which made it harder still but for Jim's steady management, and for the curious fact that the creditors stood like a row of blocks where the fall of one would touch off the whole line. Matters would have gone to smash long ago. Each man feared to move, lest he bring his own creditors down on him. Until lately they have not troubled Jim much, outside of wringing out every dollar of interest while his sisters were single. He was bound to keep a home for them. Nina's marriage last spring removed that duty, and I think the release is in some sort of relief. Even though the parting is bitter, what a pity. Old Mr. Bird persuaded Mary to sell her bonds and invest in tobacco during the war, said Mrs. Mason. Sadly, the bonds would have been something for the children. It was too bad that the great Richmond warehouses full of tobacco belonging to the Birds and the Masons were burned at the evacuation. Charlie Mason persuaded Mr. Bird into that speculation, and though Charlie is my own cousin and Mary's brother, I must admit he did wrong. Your father always disapproved the sale of those bonds, Berkeley answered more gently than the words themselves. The speculation was a good one, and would have paid splendidly had events run, otherwise no one could foresee the burning of Richmond. Cousin Mary's money could not have freed Shirley, but had things gone well, that tobacco would have done it, and left a handsome surplus. Charlie Mason has fine judgment, and that he failed then was no fault of his own. It was the fortune of war. Mrs. Mason sighed and let the subject drop, still unconvinced and still regretful that Mr. Bird had ruled his wife's patrimony. It would have been a serviceable nest egg for the children, and a help to Jim in his long struggle. All her life she had seen husbands hold full control over their wives' property, using it as their own, and she had taken little thought of the equities to her. It seemed natural that a wife's surrender should include things financial, yet here it felt hard. It would have been so pleasant for Jim to have had some money, and to have held Shirley. Pocahontas helped herself to hot waffles and sugared them with liberal hand. "Dear old Jim," she said quietly. "I wish he had come in. You should have insisted, Berkeley. It is cruel for him to give up the old home to strangers and begin again in a new land. I cannot bear to think of it. Jim is such a good fellow, and Mexico seems a long way off. When is he coming to say goodbye to us, Burke? This evening he is coming to tea, so mind you have something special." After a pause, Mrs. Mason asked whether he had heard anything about the purchaser of Shirley. Berkeley knew only that the place had been bought by a northern man, a retired army officer named Smith. When they rose, he lingered a moment, watching his mother gather cups and saucers onto the tray for Aunt Rachel, while Pocahontas collected scraps for the dogs. Two already poked impatient, wistful noses into the room beyond the threshold. They were not allowed to intrude, but they stood in the passage, whining and giving sharp little yaps at hope deferred when they saw their mistress coming with the heaped plate. They let joy have the rein, jumping and barking about her with delight. Pocahontas loved animals. The nobleness and fidelity of their instincts harmonized with the large faithfulness of her own nature. When his sister was out of hearing, Berkeley reopened the topic of Jim Bird standing at the mantel. He filled his pipe and balanced it against an ornament, his back toward his mother as he spoke. "Mother, did it ever occur to you that Jim might grow fond of Pocahontas, might want her for a wife? I fancy something of the kind has happened, and that he came to grief. He has been depressed and unhappy for months, and neither business nor the trouble about the old place can explain how he has shunned us of late. I do not believe he has been inside this house twice in 3 months." Mrs. Mason's voice was very gentle. "Yes, my dear, I have often thought of it. Long before Jim thought of it himself, he spoke to Princess this summer, and she refused him. She did not tell me. But little things, let me guess it closely. It is a great disappointment to me, for I scarcely remember when the hope first dawned that they might love each other. Mary Mason and I were warm friends as well as cousins, and it seemed natural our children should marry. Berkeley knew that his mother had once wished him to marry Belle or Susie, and that this was not the first time her hope for a Bird-Mason match had failed. Had Temple lived, Nina Bird would have been his wife. The two had been sweethearts from babyhood. Mrs. Mason sighed regretfully. "I wish it could have been," she said. "Jim is such a good fellow, always gentle and careful with the little girls. Even when he grew into a great rough lad, such a little chevalier in his feelings, too. I remember one Christmas just after the war, when he was about 14, the children wanted Christmas greens to decorate the parlor. It was the fall you were in the South, and they hoped to make the room pretty to welcome you home. Susie, Nina, and my 2 girls went into the Shirley woods, and Jim went with them. They found plenty of lovely holly, but no mistletoe. You know how scarce it is here. At last Pocahontas spied a splendid bunch, full of pure waxen berries, way up in the top of a tall oak. There had been heavy sleet the night before, and every limb was caked with ice. Slippery as glass, climbing was doubly dangerous, and Grace begged him not to try. But that foolish Pocahontas looked disappointed, and Jim dashed straight at the tree. Grace said it made her sick to watch him. For every minute she expected to see him slip and come crashing down. The little girls cried, and Grace boxed Jim's ears the instant he stood safe on the ground with the mistletoe. The children came home in great excitement, Pocahontas hugging the mistletoe tight, tears pouring down her cheeks. When I scolded Jim for his recklessness, he opened those honest hazel eyes of his and said, "But Princess wanted it," as if that were reason enough for risking his life. Poor little Princess. She paused a moment, then added softly, "I wish she could have loved him, as we hoped. Marriage is a terrible risk for a girl like her," she went on. "She is too straightforward, too uncompromisingly intolerant of everyday littleness. To have a very peaceful life, she has grown up so different from other girls, full of ideals and romance. She belongs, in thought and motive, to the last century, rather than to this. She is large-hearted and capable of great affection, but she is self-willed, and she could be hard upon occasion. If she should fall into weak or wicked hands, she would both endure and inflict untold suffering. Yet within her there is endless power of generosity and self-sacrifice. Poor child, with Jim. I could have trusted her, but she couldn't love him, and there is nothing to be done." Berkeley stirred impatiently, and his mother looked at him with quiet patience. "Why couldn't she?" he demanded. "She'll never do better. Jim's a handsome fellow, as men go, brave, honorable, and sweet-tempered. What more does she want? It looks like sheer perversity." Mrs. Mason smiled indulgently at her son's masculine obtuseness, and yet she tried to explain it isn't perversity. Berkeley, having always regarded Jim as a kindly old playmate and big brotherly friend, the idea of sentiment with him seemed absurd. Had they ever been separated, the affair might have ended differently, but there has never been a break. Jim always here, always the same, that will not do with a girl like Princess. It is too commonplace, too devoid of interest and uncertainty. I know it sounds like folly to you, but it is nature. Princess, I fear, sets undue value on intellect, holding less brilliant endowments cheap beside it, and we must admit, dearly as we love Jim Bird, a noble fellow as he is, he has not the intellectual power that commands admiration. With all my respect for intellect, I can see that Princess greatly overrates it. She has often declared that unless a man were intellectually her superior, she could never love him. Mrs. Mason folded her hands, as if the case were gently closed intellectually. A fiddlestick, scoffed Berkeley. She does not know what she wants, or what is good for her. Women rarely do, with their longing after novelty and fine scorn of homespun truth. They choose like bats, and repent in sackcloth, or in a divorce court. Were I a woman, he finished with a half sigh, I should esteem the size of my husband's heart and the sweetness of his temper far above the bigness of his brain or the freshness of the acquaintance. Mrs. Mason shook her head with tender patience. Very true, my son, but you cannot alter women. Their hearts must go as nature wills, and lookers-on can only pray God to guide them rightly. And you are unjust to your sister, she added, gently. Pocahontas has sound discrimination and a clear judgment. Her inability to meet our wishes is no proof that her choice will fall unworthily. Berkeley made no answer, but looked unconvinced, and soon withdrew to attend to the plantation, thinking profound thoughts about women, most of them mistaken in the afternoon. Pocahontas took a book and a gaily colored feather fan, and settled herself in the old split-bottomed rocking chair. Deep in the porch's shadow, the day had been close and sultry, and even the darkened rooms felt stifling. Outside it was better, though the freshness of morning had fled and evening had not yet come. The sun sank westward, sending long rays across the river, whose still waters gleamed with opalescent splendor. The slender willow leaves at the lawn's edge drooped, showing their silver linings, and the sky was one tawny blaze of color. Sailboats rocked gently with the sluggish current, drifting rather than sailing on their way. Once a noisy, throbbing steamer, all life and purpose, dashed past, churning the water and tearing the slumberous air with its whistle. It jarred upon the quiet beauty, and it was a relief when it swept around a bend and left only a soft trail of blue smoke. One of the setters, who had hidden in the cool house through the hottest hours, slipped out, stretched, and lay down in the shade, panting and yawning. Pocahontas was the one cool note in the picture. Sitting in the porch shadow in her white dress, a Cape jessamine blossom shone purely against the bronze knot of her hair, and another nestled among the lace on her breast. The volume of Emerson, chosen for the enlargement of her mental vision, lay unheeded in her lap, and the big fan moved lazily. Her gray eyes gazed out over the parched lawn and the glistening river until the light nearly blinded them. She was thinking of Jim, and her heart was tender with pity. She grieved for his pain in parting, for his disappointment in regard to herself, and for her own inability to give him the love he longed for. She would have loved him had it been in her power, and honestly regretted that her calm, true sisterly affection could not be made warmer. Her friends wished it, his friends wished it. It seemed so natural and proper, and yet, with her, it had not happened to Pocahontas. Marriage was a very sacred thing, not to be contemplated lightly, nor entered into without the sanctification of a pure, unselfish love. If she married Jim now, it would be with the knowledge that the depths of her nature were unstirred, the true rich gold still hidden. It did not seem to her that her old playfellow's hand was destined to stir the one or discover the other. Loyal to Jim, she could not imagine he would be satisfied with anything less than her very best. As the sun dipped lower, a vagrant breeze stole out from some leafy covert, and played softly along the porch. The big Irish setter moved to the top step and ceased yawning. An old colored man crossed the lawn in quest of the colts, and the dog bounded forward to lend assistance. He was diverted, however, by the approach of two gentlemen who must be welcomed with full ceremony. Pocahontas rose and came out of the shadow to meet them. Jim Bird and a tall, broad-shouldered man with a great silky red beard, her brother-in-law, Mr. Royal Garnett. After a joyous exchange of greetings with the brother-in-law she dearly loved, and a sweet, gracious welcome to her old playfellow, she withdrew to tell her mother of their arrival. She wished to be sure everything was perfectly arranged for Jim's last meal among them. Unable to give him what he most desired, she lavished all she could. She wore her prettiest dress in his honor and adorned it with his favorite flowers, forgetting in her eagerness to please him that such care might make farewell harder. She ordered all the dishes she knew he liked for tea, and spent hours that scorching morning in the hot kitchen, baking a cake he always praised from the glass-doored cabinet. She took the rare old mason china. She rifled the rose garden to fill the quaint, century-old punch bowl for the center of the table. All should be done to make Jim feel, that night, the honored guest, the person of most importance in their world. The mason china was an heirloom, quaint and curious, and dearly prized a superstition, none knew its origin, held that the breakage of a piece by design or accident foreboded misfortune to the house of Mason. Carefully it was kept, used only on rare occasions when special honor was intended. During the Civil War, it had lain hidden in a heavy box under the brick pavement of a cellar room, and thus escaped dire vicissitudes. Many pieces had been broken over the years, each said to be followed by calamities harder to bear than the loss of porcelain. Yet much remained. Its design was unique, its execution wonderful, and its history romantic. Long ago, a rich and fanciful mason had visited the colonies with an expedition of the Virginia Company of London. He was an artist of no mean repute, and in the New World he made sketches of strange, beautiful scenery and studies from the wild, picturesque life that captivated his imagination. After his return to England, he perfected these drawings from memory. Years later, he crossed into France and had them transferred to China at fabulous cost. The result was exquisite, each piece a small portrayal of life and landscape in the New World. The scenes were varied and softly glowing. On one cup, a hunter followed the chase through the silent forest. On another, a dusky maiden dreamed beside a waterfall. On a third, deer rested in a sunny valley. On a fourth, braves circled a council fire when, in after years, the artist's grandson married a bride with Indian blood. A great punch bowl was added in special compliment to the lady. The china was sent as a wedding gift from the Masons of England to the Masons of Virginia. The bowl was very graceful. On one side it showed the landing at Jamestown, the tranquil river, a vessel in the offing, and friendly red men upon the shore. On the other side, as was fitting, the rescue of Captain John Smith by the Indian girl. Wreaths of Virginia creepers, forest leaves and blossoms finished the rim and base like garlands. To bring out this precious heirloom in honor of a guest was to make him of consequence. Indeed, Jim knew it, and seeing the pretty table, understood the girl's intention. He shot a quick, grateful glance at her from his brown eyes, and a dark memory of a superb breakfast once served to a man about to be hanged flickered up, but he banished it loyally as he took the cup with the dreaming maiden. He said gratefully, "How good of you to bring out the beautiful old china in my honor. When I was a boy, I always imagined that coffee from these cups tasted different, had a woodsy, adventurous flavor. I think so still. It was a merry meal, despite the shadow of parting. The gentlemen, taking their cue from Pocahontas, vied in light talk and in painting ridiculous scenes of camp life in the tropics, with Jim invariably the hero shaking off the dismal emotions peculiar to farewell visits. He responded gallantly, and threw what cheerful rays he could upon his exile, knowing these old friends were sorry to lose him, and sought to soften the wrench. The quiet, self-controlled man, more given to action than speech, with a deep abhorrence of scenes, appreciated their efforts. After tea, Berkeley and Royal lit their pipes and strolled toward the stables, leaving Jim and Pocahontas alone on the porch. The girl leaned back in her chair, silent now, and Jim sat on the steps at her feet, his eyes following wistfully the slope of the lawn and the flow of the river presently, without turning his head. He asked her to walk with him down to the old willows by the riverside for a farewell look at the scene so dear to him, and Pocahontas rose at once and slipped her hand within his arm. Down by the water, where the lawn bent softly to the wooing of the current, stood two ancient willows of unusual size, gnarled with age, yet vigorous and long-limbed. They held the night in their sweeping green. The story ran that once a Pocahontas Mason, lady of the manor here, had lovers twain, twin brothers who, being also Masons, were her distant cousins. One she loved, and one she did not, but both loved her, and, being passionate men, both swore they would have her come what might, and cause any man that came between them most bloodily to rue it. Quarrels arose between the brothers, and ill feeling, which afflicted the lady, who was a good woman and averse to breaking the peace of families, that brothers, twin brothers, should be scowling venomously at each other because of her appeared a grievous thing, and she set herself to mend it by marrying the man she loved. She could end the affair at once, but his brother would never forgive him, and before love had maddened them, the men had been friends as well as brothers. She gauged their characters thoughtfully, and hit upon a plan which, at the expense of some self-sacrifice, would arrange the matter peacefully. Bidding both lovers attend her one day, she brought them to this spot, and cutting two willow wands of exactly the same length and thickness, she set them deep into the moist soil, and announced her decision. They would wait 3 years, she said, and at the end of that time, the man whose tree grew the stronger should come and claim his answer. She would tend both willows herself, giving each the same care, and treating them with equal fairness. Then she made the men shake hands in amity once more, and swear to abide by her decision. The story further tells that both willows flourished finely, but that in the last year the true love's tree outstripped its mate, as was right and proper, as the lady had anticipated. When the term of probation expired, only one of the twins appeared to claim his answer, and in the pocket of the constant man, when he kissed his own true love, lay a letter from across the seas, full of brotherly affection and congratulation. This little story was a favorite with Pocahontas, and she liked to tell how her great-great-grandmother, by a little wit and generous self-sacrifice, averted a feud between brothers and kept family peace unbroken. The trees were always called the lovers, and under their sweeping branches the young people were fond of gathering on moonlit summer evenings. Pocahontas seated herself beneath the larger tree on the dry, warm grass, and Jim leaned against the rugged trunk, drinking in the still beauty of the night, the silvery sheen of the water, the pure bend of the sky, the slope of the lawn, and the gray tranquility of the old house beyond. As he gazed, there awoke in his breast, adding to its pain, that weary yearning which men call homesickness, with a shuddering sigh and a movement of the strong shoulders, as though some burden settled down upon them. Jim dropped to the ground beside her and let her gently possess herself of his tobacco pouch and pipe. The girl felt that the peacefulness of the scene jarred upon his mood, and set herself to soothe him into harmony with himself and with nature. Jim watched the white fingers deftly fill the bowl and strike the match. Then he took it from her hand and breathed softly through the curved stem until the fire circled brightly round and the tobacco burned. He leaned back on his elbow and sent the smoke out in long, quiet wreaths, and Pocahontas, with her hands folded in her lap, watched it rise and vanish dreamily. "I wonder," she murmured presently, "if the nights out there, in Mexico I mean, can be more beautiful than this. I have read descriptions and dreamed dreams, but I cannot imagine anything more perfect than that stretch of water, shimmering in the moonlight, and the dark outline of the trees yonder against the sky. It's more than beautiful. It's home." Jim's voice shook a little. "Do you know, Princess, that whenever the memory of home comes to me out yonder, in the tropics, it will be just this picture. I shall see the river, the lights and shadows on the lawn, the old gray house, and you, with the flowers on your breast and the moonlight on your dear face. Don't be afraid, or move away. I'm not going to make love to you. All that is over. But your face must always be to me the fairest and sweetest on earth." He paused, then added, looking steadily away from her, "I want to tell you, this last time I may ever have the chance to speak with you alone, that you are never to blame yourself for what has come and gone. It has been no fault of yours. You could no more help my loving you than I could help it, nor could you make yourself love me in return." "Oh, Jim, dear," the girl spoke quickly and penitently, "I do love you. I do indeed. I know it, Princess, in exactly the same way you love Roy Garnett, and immeasurably less than you love Berkeley. That isn't what I wanted. Dear, I am a dull fellow, slow at understanding things, and I cannot put my thoughts into graceful, fluent language, but I know what love is. And what I wanted you to feel is very different. Do not be unhappy about it. About me, I'll worry through the pain in time or grow accustomed to it. It's tough just at first, but I'll pull through somehow. It shall not spoil my life either, although it must mar it. A man must be a pitiful fellow who lets himself go to the bad, because the woman he loves will not have him. God means every man to hold up his own weight in this world. I'd as soon strike a woman down as throw the blame of a wasted life upon her." Pocahontas listened with her eyes on her folded hands, realizing for the first time how deeply the man beside her loved her. Would any other man ever love her with such grand unselfishness, she wondered, ever give all, receive nothing in return, and still give on? Why could she not love him? Why was her heart still and speechless, and only her mind responsive? He was worthy of any woman's love. Why could not she give him hers? Ask the question how she would. The answer was always the same. She did not love him. She could not love him. But the reason was beyond her. After a little while, Jim spoke again. "When you were a little girl," he said, "I was always your knight in all our plays and troubles. It was always me. You wanted my boat was the one you liked best, and my dog and horse would come to your whistle as quickly as to mine. I was the one to care for you and carry out your will that can never be again. I know. But don't forget me, Princess. Let the thought of your old friend come to you sometimes, not to trouble you, only to remind you when things are hard and rough and you need comfort, that there's a heart in the world that would shed its last drop to help you with quick impulse." Pocahontas leaned forward and caught his hand in hers, and before he could divine her intention, bent her head and laid her soft, warm lips against it. When she lifted her eyes to his, there were tears in them, and her voice trembled as she said, "I will think of you often, old friend, of how noble you are, and how unselfish you've been. Generous to me all my life, far more generous than I have ever deserved." As they rose to return to the house, the jasmine blossom fell from the girl's hair to the ground at Jim's feet. He stooped and raised it. "May I keep it?" he said. She bowed her head silently, and the night folded the river in silver. Once more morning came, heavy with warmth, in the dining room. At Lanarth stood Pocahontas, an expression of comical dismay upon her face, a pile of dusty volumes at her feet. The bookcase by the fireplace, with yawning doors and empty shelves, stood swept and garnished, awaiting repossession in a frenzy of untimely cleanliness. She had torn all the books from the repose of years, and now, with the deed past recall, she was a prey to disgust and repentance. The day promised to be sultry, and the pile was very big. Outside, bugs and bees and other wise things hummed and sang in leafy places. The magnolia leaves were motionless, and the air asleep. A butterfly, passing to his siesta on the bosom of a rose, paused on the window ledge to contemplate her foolishness. The flowers in the borders hung their heads. Berkeley passed the open window, cool and fresh in his summer clothes, and Pocahontas, catching sight of him, put her fingers to her lips and whistled sharply, then followed with gestures of despair and a plea for swift assistance. He turned good-naturedly and came in to the rescue, but when he discovered the service required of him, he regarded it with aversion and showed a mean desire to retreat, an unworthiness Pocahontas promptly detected and frustrated. "Do help me, Berkeley," she entreated. "They must all be put in place again before dinner, and it only wants 1:45. I can't do it before 2:30 to save my life, unless you help me. You know Mother dislikes a messy, littered room, and I've got your favorite pudding for dessert. Oh dear, I'm tired to death already, and it's so warm." "What made you do it?" Berkeley asked, in a tone meant to make her sensible of folly. "Mother asked me to dust the books some time ago, but I neglected it, and this morning, when the sun shone on them, I saw their condition was disgraceful. I was so disgusted with my untidiness that I dragged them all out on the impulse of the moment, and only realized how hot it was, and how I hated it after the deed was done. Come, Burke, do help me. I'm so tired." Thus adjured, Berkeley laid aside his coat, for lifting his warm work with the sun at the meridian. His empty shirt sleeve had a forlorn look, as it hung crumpled and slightly twisted by his side. He caught it with his other hand and tucked the cuff into his waistband. He was well used to his loss and apparently indifferent to it. But the dangling sleeve worried him. The arm was gone. Close up at the shoulder, they fell to work briskly, dusting, arranging, rearranging, and chatting pleasantly. Pocahontas plied the duster, and her brothers sorted the books and replaced them on the shelves. The sun shone in royally, until Pocahontas served a writ of ejectment by closing the shutters, and the sun promptly eluded it by peeping in between the bars. A little vagrant breeze stole in, full of idleness and mischief, and meddled with the books, fluttering the leaves of the Fairy Queen as it lay on its back, lifting the pages and flirting them roguishly, as though bent on finding secrets. The little noise caught the girl's attention, and she raised the book and wiped the covers with her duster as she slapped it lightly to shake out the dust. A letter slipped from among the leaves and fell to the floor near Berkeley's feet. "Where did this come from?" he asked, picking it up out of this book. She answered, holding up the volume. "It fell out while I was dusting. Someone must have left it in to mark a place. It must have been in the book for years. See how soiled it is." "Whose is it?" There is something in the unexpected finding of a stray letter that stirs curiosity, and Berkeley turned it in his hand to read the address. The envelope was soiled like the coat of a traveler, and the paper was crumpled as though a hand had closed roughly over it. The writing was distinct and clerkly. Berkeley Mason, ESQ, Wintergreen, Co., Virginia. He examined the blurred postmark point. Something, it seemed. And on the other side, Washington, plain enough. And the date, May 1865. What letter had been forwarded to him from the seat of government in the spring of 65? Then memory unfolded itself like a map whose spring was loosed. Seating himself in an easy chair, he drew the letter from its envelope, unfolding it slowly against his knee. It was a half-sheet of ordinary commercial paper, with perhaps a dozen lines. Mason winced at sight of the heading as though an old wound had been pressed, and his sister, leaning over the back of his chair, read with him, her hand brushing the page flat. It ran thus: Point Lookout, May, 1865, to Berkeley Mason, ESQ, Virginia. The letter had been written with urgency. A Confederate soldier, giving his name as Temple Mason, lay at the point of death in the prison hospital at Point Lookout. He had been too ill to be sent south with the general transfer, and he begged that his friends be told if he died without word from home, he feared he would be buried in the common cemetery and his identity lost. Come to him, in God's name, the letter pleaded. It was signed, simply, Percival Smith Berkeley Mason, slid the letter back into its envelope, and sat thinking it was one of the many messages of sorrow that drifted through the country after the war. One murmur in a long, low dirge across the land. Pocahontas came and settled on her brother's knee, her wide gray eyes full of questions. "When did this come? I never saw it before," she asked, quietly so, with a voice that faltered now and then. He told her the sad story of the closing months of that unhappy struggle in the autumn of '64. Their brother Temple, a lad of 17, had been taken prisoner while on a reconnaissance, and no word could be found of his condition or his prison. Berkeley himself had been home on sick leave, weak and worn, with the loss of his arm, and a saber cut across his head through winter and spring, while calamity followed calamity. The anxiety about Temple deepened, sharpened by the conflicting tales of passing soldiers. At last this letter had come, turning dread into certainty. A federal officer in Richmond had given it to Roy Garnett, and Roy rode straight down with it over the weary miles. Sharing their fear and hope, he helped with the hurried preparations, and he went with Berkeley and their pale, steadfast mother on that desperate mission. There was the harsh journey, the arrival at the prison, the fearful questions, and the sharp relief of answers. The commandant, a bluff, kindly man, took their hands and gave every aid in the rough hospital of a hostile prison. They waited for the end, and then came the stranger, sadder homecoming. A common story, north and south, but no less pitiful for being common. With her head on Berkeley's shoulder, Pocahontas sobbed softly. She knew the outline of it all, but not the details. She had been very young when these things happened. The brother who slept in the shadow of the cedars was scarcely more than a name to her. Childhood memories had faded before the bright stir of her glad girlhood. When she spoke again, it was very gently. "Berkeley, it was kindly done of that federal officer to let us know. This is the third letter he wrote about poor Temple. The others must have miscarried. They did. And this one reached us only just in time." He said in those early days, "Nothing was certain if Roy hadn't been in Richmond. Who knows whether I should have received it? General Smith was a kindly man. I shall never forget his consideration for my mother, nor the care he showed Temple. Without his help, we could hardly have managed. Even with Roy's efforts, we owe him a debt of gratitude. God bless him." "Amen," Pocahontas whispered. Morning came bright and crisp about the middle of October. In the backyard, Pocahontas stood amid a flock of turkeys, handsome birds from light red to deep glossy black. Sunlight glanced on their feathers, flashing green, purple, and blue. That royal glow that seems to gather many hues at once. The birds bent their heads to the corn she scattered, and now and then the great gobblers puffed and spread their tails, throwing their crimson heads back to strut in pride. Turkeys were her specialty, the only creatures of the poultry yard on which she bestowed her personal care from the thrilling day she penciled the date on the first egg of spring to the time the full-grown birds went to Aunt Rachel to be fattened. They were under her hand. Morning and afternoon she appeared with a pan of curds or a loaf of brown bread to tend her flock. Often she was followed by a little boy, Sawney, grandson of Aunt Rachel, inky black, comically grave, and thoroughly spoiled, he adored Pocahontas, and trailed after her wherever she allowed it feeding time, brought him as surely as it brought the turkeys, for she never forgot a biscuit or a bit of sugar for him with the largest black gobbler. However, he was at war, for more than once the wily bird had whisked his treat from his unsuspecting hand and borne it off in triumph half the time. Sawney threw tiny stones at his enemy, never truly hitting him, while the gobbler paused now and then to gobble him to scorn. This morning, the feud-dozed Sawney ate his biscuit in peace and held his tongue. Pocahontas had just emptied her basket and was admiring her flock when Berkeley stepped out on the porch with a letter. "Look here, Princess," he called, a touch of hurry in his voice. "A letter from Jim, for old Aunt Violet. His nurse, it came with my mail, and I haven't time to go to Shirley and read it to her. She's too poorly to come for it. Put on your bonnet and take it now, will you? Step over there." "Indeed," she laughed, joining him. "How serenely you say it. Aunt Violet's cabin is beyond Jim Bird's line fence, half a mile past General Smith's line fence." "You mean," he corrected, "there's money in the letter, and I don't want it going by chance hands. I promised Jim we'd look after her. The girls want her in Richmond, but she won't leave the old place. She has no children of her own, you know." Pocahontas took the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She should go to Richmond with Belle or Nina. She set out in California with Susie. She'd die of homesickness. I wonder if the new people will let her stay at Shirley. Oh yes, Jim arranged it when he saw she wouldn't move. He made an understanding with General Smith about the bit of land where her cabin stands, reserved it or leased it. It's all in order, always kind, always considerate, thought Pocahontas. Even in the haste and pain of parting, he had made time to see to his old nurse's comfort. Good, faithful Jim. "Have the new people come?" she asked, as Berkeley turned away. "I think so," he said. "I saw smoke from the kitchen chimney this morning. Ask Aunt Rachel. The servants always know." She paused at the kitchen door to tell them to inform her mother she had walked to Shirley to read a letter to Aunt Violet and would be home in an hour. Then she set out, never noticing that little Sawney, murmuring, "I'm going too," trotted determinedly after her. The way stretched along a pleasant country road, level as a table, running straight from the Mason's back gate to the ancient home of the Bird family above. Oak and magnolia wove a canopy of glossy green and russet, and the sunshine, sifting through, embroidered the road with light and shadow. Now and then a holly tree, bright with berries, kindled a cheerful touch of color and whispered of Christmas. She sauntered, glad of the morning, her thoughts drifting to the past and the three bird girls who had been her playmates. And to Jim, by that holly there, Nina had tumbled over a fence into a muddy puddle while chasing a little striped ground squirrel, and afterward shook Pocahontas and Susie for laughing. And in that meadow, she had once scrambled up a tree to escape an unruly heifer, and sat among the branches, frightened and forlorn, until Jim, riding home from school, spied her and brought her down. Her mind wandered on to the new arrivals, shaping them kindly in her imagination. Agreeable people, refined and pleasant to know. The name gave no clue. People named Smith could be almost anything. The name was quiet and common, but it hid many possibilities as Percival floated through her thoughts. It slipped into place beside it. Percival Smith, of course, that was the name at the foot of the old letter about Temple. This newcomer was, or had been, an officer. A general. Suppose it were the same man.
No, it must be it was.
Warm with the conclusion, she began to plan how she might repay a kindness. Long remembered, her steps quickened, light as her thoughts at a fence where a short cut crossed a sheep pasture to Aunt Violet's cabin. She climbed, and only then noticed the small follower at her heels. "Why, Sawney, who told you to come?" she asked, Dropping lightly to the far side, he clambered carefully over and peered up at her, eyes twinkling. "Nobody, I came myself. I'm going with you. There are sheep in this field. They'll scare you," she warned, half smiling. "Not afraid," he declared. She hesitated. It was too far to send him back alone, and he would surely follow anyway. Better to keep him close very well. "Come on," she said at last, "since you've come this far. You may as well come all the way. But if the sheep run after us, remember, you're not afraid, and don't cry. And don't cling to my dress with those dirty little hands, do you understand?" "Yes," said Sawney, all eagerness again, and fell in behind her with small, determined steps. They went on quietly until they were midway of the field. When the mishap Pocahontas had foreseen came to pass, a flock of sheep, grazing at a little distance, lifted their heads and came trotting with cheerful bleats, plainly taking the pair for kindly spirits who carried Salt Sawney. Perjured Sawney, forgetful of his promise, stopped short at sight of them, the small muscles of his face working ominously. "Come on, Sawney," the young lady urged, gentle but firm. "The sheep will not hurt you. They only think we have salt." Yet the child would not credit such peaceable intentions. He dropped to the ground with a howl that startled the air and seized her dress with both grimy hands, while the sheep pressed closer, jostling one another in eager expectation. The boldest came near enough to sniff at her skirts. Their soft eyes lifted to her face. This only drew fresh cries from Sawney. They were harmless, rams and all, which made his behavior the more provoking. Pocahontas coaxed, then threatened, commanded, promising solemnly that the sheep would not harm him, and tartly that if he did not hush and rise, she would leave him for the sheep to eat. An awful fate, and utterly impossible. He clung the tighter. She took off her hat and waved it, which startled the flock, though they soon came on again, closer and more insistent, patience nearly spent. She caught the child by the shoulders and gave him a brisk shake, when a quiet voice at her elbow said, "Perhaps I can be of service to you." She started and turned. A slender, dark young man stood beside her, amusement dancing in his eyes as they traveled from her flushed, indignant face to the sulky, tear-stained little visage at her feet. "Oh, thank you. You can indeed," she said at once, "if you will kindly drive the sheep away. I shall be much obliged. This provoking boy is afraid of them, or pretends to be, and I cannot move him now." "Sawney, hush this abominable noise. The gentleman will drive every sheep away with perfect gravity and a sparkle under his lashes." Nesbit Thorne flourished his cane and strode toward the flock. They backed at once. "Will that do?" he called when he had turned them a good 100 yards a little farther. "Please," she answered, laughter trembling in her voice. "No, a great deal farther, quite to the end of the field. He will not move yet." Feeling like Little Boy Blue brought smartly to duty, Thorne pursued them without mercy, convinced at last that disappointment must be their lot. The poor creatures trotted meekly before him, uttering now and then a bleat of gentle reproach. Meanwhile, Pocahontas lifted Sawney to his feet and led him to the opposite fence, got him safely over, and made him sit still to quiet his nerves and recover his behavior. She remained within the field herself, leaning on the fence to await the gentleman's return and thank him by the time he came back. Nesbit Thorne had concluded that his new acquaintance was a very handsome and unusually attractive woman, and that this little adventure might bear a pleasant sequel. He raised his hat with courteous ease, jested lightly upon the demoralized state of her escort, and wondered aloud that any country child should fear farm creatures. "Yes, it is unusual," she agreed, smiling with her clear gray eyes. "No animal has ever hurt him. If he were older, I might accuse him of trying to make a sensation, but he is almost too small to pretend he is a troublesome monkey, and had I seen him following, I should have sent him back. I am much indebted to you. Without your help, he would have sat on the ground screaming until a rescue party set out from home. Where the sheep had gone of their own good, well, not so bad as that, I hope, he returned, offering his hand to help her mount the fence. He noticed the fine shape of the hand she gave him, and the glimpse of a pretty, arched foot. He would gladly have lingered in the golden air, even walked on beside her for a while. But there was no mistaking the quiet decision with which she repeated her thanks and bade him good morning. He leaned upon the fence in his turn and watched her go. The figure light and assured against the wide field, she walked well, without any of the small awkwardnesses so common, firm and upright, head finely poised, her motion all soft curves, her look and voice suited her carriage. She pleased his artistic sense, and his lids lowered, as a man narrows his gaze to dwell upon a picture or a statue. Thorn's taste, fastidious and exact, ruled him in most things, save when passion was roused or will thwarted. Women amused him oftener than they interested him. He sought what he had not found, originality joined to unselfishness, yet, even in that brief exchange, Pocahontas touched a faint chord no woman had touched before. It sounded very softly, yet enough to make him listen. Her ready, unembarrassed acceptance of help, and her calm, courteous dismissal of him, piqued his curiosity and pleased him. He thought, with an agreeable certainty, that they would soon meet again. Selecting a cigar, he smiled. The smile broadened into a laugh as he remembered himself herding sheep away from a squalling little rebel, at the bidding of a young lady he had never seen before. What would Norma have said to that scene later, when they were all at dinner? Pocahontas told her tale with relish, and it provoked great mirth. Berkeley teased that her rescuer would prove to be one of General Smith's Washington workmen, employed upon the renovation at Shirley, perhaps a gentlemanly carpenter, or even a fresco man roving in search of an idea for a dining room ceiling. She, he declared, had obligingly supplied it, and he could make a capital design of herself, Sawney, and the sheep. Pocahontas scouted these fancies, declaring gaily that the dark stranger must be her Smith, the very John of her destiny. Later she confided to her brother her guess as to their new neighbor's identity, and was more pleased than surprised when he told her she was right. He had the news from the solicitor at Wintergreen, employed in the transfer of the estate in the days that followed. The Smith family settled promptly into their new home, and when the first strangeness wore off, they owned that country life was less disagreeable than they had feared. The neighborhood was kindly and well-peopled. The welcome, warm Mrs. Smith still sighed in secret for modern conveniences and the comforts of a daily market, and time alone could sweeten the trials of uncertain servants. Yet even she found compensations. Her husband, whose hours had hung heavily since his retirement, was now busy and contented, brimful of plans, delighting in new machines for the hands to try and in fertilizers. By the time the girls were pleased, and Norma happier and less difficult than she had been for years. Best of all, Warner seemed to gain strength. As for Percival, his joy ran over. His father had given him a gun, and Nesbit Thorne was teaching him how to use it. At the last moment, Thorne chose to come with his kin instead of waiting to visit later idleness, and ennui urged him, tinged by curiosity to see how their new life would shape itself, and by a true wish to be of use in the troublesome change, perhaps. Besides, there stirred in him an unowned feeling that New York, left lonelier by their going, would weary him more than ever to the Smiths. His coming seemed the most natural thing. His aunt, grateful for his many services, proposed it, protesting she scarcely knew how to manage without him, and he fell in with the plan at once. He was coming for the shooting. In any case, if Norma had another guess as to why he would not be parted from them, she kept it to herself. The country gentry, led by the Masons, gave the newcomers a cordial hand and wrapped them in the friendly fold of neighborhood life. Virginia households, like their old houses, showed here and there a touch of dilapidation, and means often fell short of hospitality. Yet the intention was warm, and the Smiths, well-bred, neither arrogant nor purse-proud, soon grew easy with a little informality, overlooked small wants, and mended gaps with kindness. From the first they were much with the Lanarths, for the Masons claimed a right in them, eager with simple loyalty to repay something of a former debt when their dear one had been sick and in prison. These strangers had shown him kindness. Now kindness should return, full measure, pressed down and running over for the general. Pocahontas conceived a lively enthusiasm, which the jolly old soldier quickly discovered and cordially returned. They were excellent friends since the finding of the letter. The story of the brother she scarcely remembered had filled her thoughts. Her tender fancy magnified his youth, his courage, his hardships, and made a hero of him. Everything that had been his seemed pitiful and sacred. His saber hung above the mantel, crossed with his father's. One morning she took it down and half drew the dulled blade. The brass of hilt and scabbard trimmings was tarnished, and here and there corroded. She fetched a cloth and polished them until they shone like gold. Seeing the contrast, a rush of remorseful tenderness made her take down the other sword and brighten it. Also, poor father, almost as unknown to her as the young brother, she grieved that he should have been. The second thought, she was setting it back and laying the crimson sash, faded and streaked with years, when Norma and Blanche came in, escorted by Nesbit Thorne. Little Sawney, who had sat on the hearthrug watching and offering counsel, ran to invite them into the parlor, while Pocahontas slipped upstairs to remove the traces of her work. The young people from Shirley often walked over in the afternoons. The way was short and pleasant, and brother and sister commonly went part of the return path with them. The light lingering late upon the lanes, Thorne grew fond of these informal visits. His interest in Pocahontas deepened. The chord that had once only trembled now began to give out faint, sweet notes, like a far-off dream of music stirring toward embodiment. He took keen artistic pleasure in her presence. She satisfied a long, delicate expectation, and at first he was shy of pressing the acquaintance, lest she fail him somewhere he had been disappointed so many times, seen exquisite bubbles float before him, only to break at a touch and leave mere soapsuds behind. So he let himself be interested slowly, drawing out the pleasure and getting its full flavor when he found it was true metal, without baseness or alloy. He gave himself up to the delight of it then. As was his instinct when he desired something, he strove gently to awaken an interest in her, a man of unusually brilliant attainments. He spared no pains. He sought her society, and when with her, appeared always at his best, trying to fascinate her as she, unconsciously, began to fascinate him. He would lead her to air her old-fashioned ideas and prejudices, her primitive notions of life and conduct. Her straightforwardness, simplicity, and absolute truthfulness struck him as quaint and delicious. Even her romance and almost German sentiment attracted him. He felt like a scientist discovering old truths in a new, living form. Early in their acquaintance, he discovered her fondness for old legends and her perfect acceptance and faith in them. It became his delight to beguile her into telling the tales of her kindred and of the olden times so dear to Virginian hearts. Remarks and comments often touched him, always interested him, and sometimes almost convulsed him with amusement, for to a man of the world they seemed nearly obsolete. Pocahontas was generally willing enough to tell her stories, unless Norma happened to be present. Then the improvisatrice fell silent. Pocahontas and Norma were not in sympathy. Norma thought old stories great rubbish, and made no secret of her opinion, and Pocahontas resented it in quiet pride. One evening, early in their acquaintance, the three girls walked down to the old willows at the foot of the lawn, and, for the amusement of her guests, Pocahontas related the gentle little story, linked with those trees. "I think it was all great foolishness," said Norma. "If she loved the man, why not marry him at once? Like a sensible woman, the idea of making him wait 3 years and watch a little tree. Just because his brother would have made a scene, he would soon have submitted to the inevitable. The lady could not have cared much for her lover, to be willing to put up with that driveling probation." "She did love him," Pocahontas answered, with quiet warmth, "and she proved it by being willing to sacrifice a little of her happiness to spare him the bitterness of a quarrel with his own brother. The men were twins, and they loved one another until unnatural rivalry pushed family affection into the background. If the matter had been settled when both were at white heat, an estrangement might have followed that years would hardly heal. If it was ever healed at all, there is no passion so unyielding as family hate." She went on gently. "They were her kinsmen too, men of her own blood. She must think of them outside herself. The welfare of the man she did not love must be considered, as well as that of the man she did. More, perhaps, because she gave him so much less. How could she come between twin brothers and turn their affection into hatred? She knew them both, the true and constant lovers she could safely trust for 3 years. The lighter nature might prove inconstant, and if he left her of his own free will, there would be no ill feeling and no remorse." Norma laughed lightly, and in this fine self-sacrifice, she had no thought of her lover. She sacrificed him too. "And why not?" said Pocahontas, still calm. Surely no man would grudge a paltry 3 years out of a whole life's happiness to avoid so dreadful a thing as ill blood between twin brothers. If she could wait for his sake, he could wait for hers. A woman must not cheapen herself. If she is worth winning, she must exact the effort. "I think it is a lovely story," Blanche said decidedly. "The lady behaved beautifully, just as she should. A quarrel between brothers is awful, and between twin brothers, worse still, in her eager partisanship." Blanche's language was more hearty than elegant, but her meaning was clear, and she wished Pocahontas to feel her at her side. Norma regarded her sister with amused chagrin. These new friends were stealing away her follower. Blanche was becoming emancipated. "Any woman who trifles with her happiness because of a scruple is a fool," she repeated, dogmatically. Pocahontas held back the angry retort that rose to her lips, and let the subject drop. Norma was her guest, and after all, what did it matter what she thought? After that evening, Pocahontas refrained from repeating old stories before her, and of the two sisters, Blanche became her favorite. So, when Pocahontas entered the parlor one mild day with smiles and words of welcome, Blanche rose to meet her with hands full of late roses and branches of green holly bright with berries. "See," she said, "2 seasons in one bouquet. The roses are for your mother. I found them on a bush in a sheltered corner, and as we came along, I made Nesbit cut the holly for me. I never can resist holly. That tree by your gate is the loveliest I have ever seen, like the ones in the store windows at home at Christmas, only we never had such a profusion of berries, nor, I think, such brightness. Do you think the holly at home is as bright, Norma?" "Oh, yes, it looked pretty much the same. We got beautiful holly every Christmas," Norma replied, unwilling to praise Virginia at the expense of her native place, "but not with such masses of berries. Just look at this branch." Her words trailed off into a pleased silence as the red lights glowed against the deep green, and the room's lamplight softened the scene. And with these words from the past, we close tonight's reading. May they bring you peace and rest as you drift into sleep.